Welcome back. And you finally have arrived at the final chapter of the Harris-Platzner textbook, Chapter 21, on the legacy of Greek mythology. Good job. We're just about wrapping up now the course as well as the video series, and this in fact will just be a very brief one to give you a couple of impressive examples of the legacy of Greek mythology. There obviously are numerous of them, far more than I could possibly cover in a short video. You can see most of them in your book, and you're welcome to write to me further comments about them if you'd like. But let me give you a couple of other examples of Greek mythology, and then I want to discuss this movie Black Orpheus, which I think is one of the most impressive examples there is of how Greek mythology gets a legacy. So as we were talking about before with Ovid, already under Roman days, there is a transformation of Greek mythology, because the interest the Romans have with mythology is essentially to justify and sometimes also make commentary on the Roman state, but always to consider the Roman state as an essential primary unit of Roman culture. Of course, with the fall of the Roman Republic and the empire subsequently, all of that is going to change drastically as other powers start coming in and replacing the monolithic setup the Romans had with their empire. So, of course, quite a few later authors pick up on mythology. Shakespeare does it very famously with Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream, with the tradition established by Antigone with Haemon and Antigone, the title character, and then later on with the Ovid metamorphosic myth, Pyramus and Thisbe, the star-crossed lovers theme. So you have that. Of course, you have Dante with the Rings of Hell. Virgil appears in Dante. And there are, of course, many other examples of films today that go back to myth, such as Troy, Alexander, Jason and the Argonauts, 300, Odyssey, and so forth. They're all over the place. You also can see examples where Greek-themed mythology can be used to express social commentary on contemporary events, much as Greek mythology itself did. And one particularly good example that is in your chapter 21 is the work of Picasso, the Spanish artist. Picasso has two famous pictures that both employ the theme of Theseus and Ariadne in the labyrinth. You see the first one that shows the rather grayish picture with the woman with the lamp guiding Theseus into the maze to go after the Minotaur. But then that whole theme gets transformed quite violently in Picasso's really famous painting, the Guernica, which is the commentary on the Spanish Civil War. You notice now, and it's described for you in the book, how horrific that same theme of Theseus and Ariadne becomes. You still have the bull, you still have the woman with the lamp, but now everything is distorted and horrific and terrified. And it appears that the horrors of war have infected this whole community as there is set up, and now everything is just in a state of deterioration and madness in effect. And that is a way for Picasso to express a very critical opinion of the civil war that was unfolding before him, much the same way that the comic playwright Aristophanes used his versions of mythology and fantastic themes to make critical comments on the war between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, as it unfolded before him. So that's what Greek mythology is able to do. Even in the hands of later artists, later commentators, later literary writers, mythology is able to become a lens for one to see contemporary society, sometimes not in a very favorable light, often deservedly so, and to be able to call for social justice or social change to occur. One final example that I will close this course with is the film Black Orpheus, which I think is especially outstanding for its application of Greek mythology in a new setting. And it's one that I would strongly recommend as your video of choice, as will be described in the next video on that assignment, if you are able to get access to it. Black Orpheus is set in Rio in the 1950s. This film, which was put together by Marcel Camus, produced by him, won the Golden Palm at the Cannes Film Festival, the Palme d'Or it's called. And this film is set in Rio during Carnival, so that most of the major characters in this film are dressed in costume for the celebration of that holiday. So the main character is Orfeo, who is a streetcar conductor. And Orfeo is betrothed to a woman named Mira, whom we learn very early on is a very temperamental, quite incendiary woman, given to flashes of jealousy and murderous rage if her will is ever crossed. Right at the beginning of the film, we see tension between the two of them that suggests that Orfeo is not entirely pleased with the relationship that he's now ensconced in with Mira. Now, at one point, also early in the film, a boat docks in Rio, and this woman, Eurydice, in a state of terror, gets off the boat and goes to see her cousin, whose name is Serafina, who happens to live next door to Orfeo. Turns out that Eurydice is being pursued by some evil person who we meet later dressed up in a death costume. And there's a lot of symbolism in this film about the depiction of death chasing after Eurydice. It's probably somewhat similar to Eurydice being chased in the original story and eventually meeting death in the form of a snake sting. So, okay, Eurydice tries to get protection from Serafina, and Serafina takes her to the celebrations in order to hide her. And it's in the midst of that Orfeo ends up meeting her. Initially, the two of them don't know each other that well, but then when Eurydice is at the celebration, she gets chased by the death pursuant, and there's this wild chase scene in which Orfeo actually confronts the death character with a knife and forces that man away, but not without a warning that he would be back. It's in this relationship that Orfeo and Eurydice begin to spawn their new love relationship, much to the eventual displeasure, of course, of Orfeo's actual fiancée, Mira. So you can see how the same kind of relationship is set up, but of course now with the element of Mira, we actually have the typical love triangle here. So what will eventually happen is that Serafina will eventually concoct that Orfeo and Eurydice will be able to have a union together during the full Carnival celebration. Orfeo is actually in a contest in which he's imagining himself as the sun. That's his costume. And it turns out that Mira is the queen of the night, like the moon and so forth. And from other mythologies, that makes her a foreboding or potentially evil figure. So Orfeo ends up dancing with who appears to be Serafina, but is actually Eurydice in disguise with Serafina's costume. However, it goes wrong because the death guy comes in on the scene again and interferes with the plot, and Mira eventually learns what's happening and unveils the disguised Eurydice and then chases after her in a murderous rage. The death guy also gets in on the scene at this point and chases Eurydice also, so she's actually being pursued twice. So she ends up in the streetcar station, and she ends up hanging from a cable. Orfeo comes in and turns on the light to find out what's going on, and accidentally, thereby, electrocutes her. That's the equivalent of the snake sting. There's then a whole sequence where Orpheus goes down a long spiral staircase with a man who we now come to realize is the same as Charon, taking him down through the underworld. He then goes into another building, which is guarded by a dog, whose name happens to be Cerberus. And this is a voodoo place where they're doing an incantation as part of a cult. And Orfeo listens to this and then is confronted by a voice behind him that sounds like Eurydice. And he's told not to turn around and look at her, but just like in the original myth, he turns around and it's in fact an old woman speaking in the voice of Eurydice. And we really can't tell whether it was Eurydice's spirit or whether it was just an illusion or hallucination from the drugs that they had there. In any event, Orfeo stumbles away and frantic with terror and anger, and finally finds Eurydice's body in the morgue. The final scene has Orfeo over the cliff of Rio with his beloved Eurydice in his arms, and then unfortunately Mira, who is still violent with rage, runs at him and throws a rock at him, and ends up sending him to his death down the cliff. So One other interesting little element of this story has to do with the guitar that Orpheus plays. He plays this instead of the lyre. There are two young boys who accompany Orfeo wherever he goes, and one of them in particular is trying to watch out for him. And one of the concerns is what's going to happen to the music that Orfeo creates on the guitar. At the very end of the film, the two boys learn how to play the guitar, and there's a girl who's with them, and they start dancing, and they produce the new generation of music that will be spawned from Orpheus's talent at poetry and music. So it has a surprisingly charming ending, considering how tragic the story itself is. This, as I say, is a really wonderful film. I've given you the basic highlights, the run-through of it, but you should really look for it, especially if you do watch it, especially pay attention to the relationship between Orfeo and Eurydice, the way that's carried out. They are, in fact, direct in making the relationship back to the original Orpheus and Eurydice, and there are quite a few little indications of the connection along the way. And of course, Orpheus's death itself, being struck in the head, is rather similar to what happens to the real Orpheus, and it's his head, of course, that eventually becomes the voice of prophecy from Thrace onto the island of Lesbos. Okay, well, I hope that gives you some inspiration to create a film connection for your final assignment, and come back for that last video so you can see what to do with your video of choice. And then, of course, we have to get to the very last video all about the final exam. Okay, we'll see you next video.